slavery didn't begin in 1619. That date, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, is a crucial moment in American history. But it's just one chapter in a much, much longer story. The truth is, slavery is an ancient institution, one that has plagued nearly every major civilization on Earth for millennia. It existed for at least 3,000 years before the first ships ever crossed the Atlantic for the slave trade. Let's unravel this complex and often misunderstood history. To find the origins of slavery, we have to travel back to the dawn of civilization itself. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most complete legal codes we have. Dating back to around 1750 BCE in ancient Babylon, already had laws about slaves. It detailed punishments for helping a slave escape and rules for buying and selling human beings. This tells us that by this point, slavery wasn't a new idea. It was already deeply embedded in society, a common, accepted part of life. So where did it come from? Most historians believe slavery emerged with the rise of agriculture and settled societies. As communities grew larger and more complex, so did warfare. Prisoners of war were one of the earliest and most common sources of slaves. Instead of being killed, captives were put to work, becoming the property of their conquerors. Another path into slavery was debt. In many ancient cultures, if you couldn't pay what you owed, you or your family members could be forced into servitude until the debt was cleared. And tragically, many people were simply born into it. Their status as property passed down from mother to child. Now, let's take a tour through the ancient world and see what slavery looked like. In ancient Egypt, the society that built the magnificent pyramids, we find a complex picture. For a long time, popular culture told us the pyramids were built by a massive slave workforce. However, most modern Egyptologists now believe the heavy lifting was done by paid, skilled Egyptian laborers, not slaves. That doesn't mean slavery didn't exist in Egypt. It did. Enslaved people, often from Nubia to the south, or from military campaigns in the Near East, worked in households, on farms, and in mines. But they weren't the primary force behind the pharaoh's greatest monuments. Moving over to ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, we see a society that was fundamentally dependent on slavery. In Athens, during its golden age, it's estimated that as much as 1/3 of the population was enslaved. These individuals had no rights, no political voice, and were considered living tools by philosophers like Aristotle. They worked in every sector of the economy, in silver mines, under brutal conditions, as domestic servants, as craftsmen, and even as clerks. The freedom for some Athenian citizens to engage in philosophy, politics, and art was built directly on the backs of an enslaved population. Then came Rome, an empire that took slavery to an unprecedented scale. At the height of the Roman Empire, some estimates suggest that up to 40% of the population in the Italian peninsula were slaves. The vast Roman conquests flooded the market with captives from all over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. You could find Gauls, Germans, Britons, Syrians, and many others sold in Roman slave markets. Slavery fueled the massive agricultural estates called latifundia, worked the mines, and served the Roman elite in their luxurious villas. Life for a Roman slave could vary dramatically. A domestic slave in a wealthy household might live in relative comfort, while those sent to the mines or the gladiator schools faced a short and brutal existence. The famous revolt, led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, where tens of thousands of slaves rose up against their Roman masters, shows the deep desperation and resistance that simmered beneath the surface of Roman society. It's also crucial to understand that ancient slavery was not based on race in the way the Atlantic slave trade was. In Rome, you were just as likely to be enslaved by Romans if you were from Germany as if you were from North Africa. Your skin color didn't determine your status. Your luck in war, your birthplace, or your economic situation did. A Roman could become a slave, and a slave from a distant land could, in very rare cases, gain freedom and even become a citizen. This is a fundamental difference from the race-based chattel slavery system that would later develop. As we move past the fall of Rome and into the medieval period in Europe, the nature of servitude began to change. The large-scale slavery of the Roman era gradually transformed into serfdom. Serfs were not property in the same way slaves were. They were tied to the land, but they had certain rights and couldn't be bought and sold as individuals. However, slavery didn't disappear. The Vikings were notorious slave traders, raiding coastal towns in Britain, France, and beyond, capturing people to sell in markets that connected to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. In the medieval Islamic world, slavery was also a significant institution. The vast trade networks stretching from Spain to India included a thriving trade in human beings. Slaves were brought from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. These enslaved people served as soldiers, administrators, servants, and laborers. The slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, even rose to become a powerful ruling dynasty in Egypt and Syria for several centuries. This demonstrates the complex and sometimes contradictory roles enslaved people could hold in different societies. Meanwhile, within Africa itself, various forms of slavery and servitude existed long before Europeans arrived. These systems were diverse and varied from one society to another. In many African kingdoms, enslaved people were a sign of wealth and power, often acquired through warfare or as tribute. However, in many of these systems, the enslaved had certain rights, could marry, own property, and even earn their freedom. Their children were not always born into slavery. It was a stark contrast to the hereditary, permanent chattel slavery that the Atlantic trade would introduce. This brings us back to why it's so important to understand this long, global history. When we only focus on 1619, we risk misunderstanding the true nature of what happened. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't the invention of slavery. It was the reinvention of it. European powers combined the ancient practice of slavery with new, brutal ideas about race and the efficiencies of capitalism. They created a system of chattel slavery that was unique in its scale, its economic efficiency, and its dehumanizing, race-based ideology. It stripped people of their humanity in a way that was systematic and permanent, treating them not just as property, but as a subspecies. By learning about slavery in Babylon, Greece, Rome, and the wider world, we don't diminish the horrors of the Atlantic trade. Instead, we put it in its proper context. We see how a timeless human cruelty was twisted into a new and particularly monstrous form. Understanding that slavery has been a global phenomenon for most of human history forces us to confront a difficult truth. The capacity for such exploitation is unconfined to one nation or one race. It's a dark thread woven through the entire story of humanity. Recognizing this long history is the first step toward truly understanding the unique and devastating legacy of the system that began to take shape in the 17th century and whose consequences we are still grappling with today. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to explore.